Welcome to today's webinar event, inspired by ICE, part of Harvard's Radcliffe Institute Climate Change Initiative. My name is Adriana Kirchun, and I am the Emma McLaughlin Metcalf Chair of Humanities at Boston University and the Francis B. Cashin Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for the current year. Inspired by ICE is part of the ICE Humanities theme in this year's virtual discussions at the Radcliffe devoted to illuminating the importance of the humanities in climate change research. Broadly speaking, ICE Humanities is a robustly interdisciplinary field, part of Arctic humanities and environmental humanities, that in the last decade has illuminated the profound agency that ICE plays in cultures around the world, across long historical time spans, and in diverse media. ICE Humanities allows us to imagine what we know about the cryosphere as animate agent, archive, aesthetic inspiration, and kin. Kin, because only during the geologic period of the serial ice ages has the human species lived and evolved. We live and die with the ice. Scientists and diverse publics increasingly look to the arts and humanities to help communicate and come to grips with the planetary changes that ice, and especially ice loss, is driving in our world. Hence the vital importance of ICE Humanities today. If you're curious and want to learn more about ICE Humanities, I recommend the recent essay collections by that name, edited by Klaus Dodds and Sverker Serlin. And now for brief introductions of our speakers. Matthew Bertner is composer and Eleanor Shea Professor of Music at the University of Virginia and the co-director of the Coastal Future Conservatory. Isabel Gapp is Assistant Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland and co-director of the Center for the North. Our moderator today is William Chang, Radcliffe Institute 2023 alum and Chair and Professor of Music at Dartmouth College. I would like to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. We also want to acknowledge gratefully the Anson Wright Dean's Leadership Fund, which is supporting this event. We encourage our viewers to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them brief. This will enable the speakers to address as many as possible in the time that we have. It is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor to William Chang.
Thank you so much. Hi, Matthew. Hi, Izzy. Thanks so much for participating in this Radcliffe webinar, where we will explore broad questions around ice, glaciers, and circumpolar environments in relation to art, both sonic and visual. Matthew, you are a composer, sound artist, and ecoacoustician. Izzy, you're an art historian who explores broadly the intersections between art and glaciology through mediums such as landscape photography, printmaking, and drawing. For starters, let's imagine that we are complete strangers meeting for the first time and making small talk at a mutual friend's house party. In these casual settings, how do you usually explain to people what it is exactly that you do?
That's a great question, and thank you for the introduction. Given that I normally spend a lot of my time mixing with scientists as well as art historians and other humanities scholars, I think it's a question that I should be better at answering than perhaps I am today. Succinctly, I would say that I am an environmental art historian of the circumpolar north with a focus on Canada and the Scandinavian countries. But my focus is mainly on landscape painting and more on landscape drawing and printmaking. I work very closely with glaciologists, and if we could cue the slide with a couple of images, I find it best as an art historian to talk with a prompt, a visual prompt, so that my words make a little bit more sense. But I work a lot with glaciologists, so I'd normally say I spend a lot of my time in the Arctic, and that would be seen in this work on the right by Ning TV, a printmaker and drawer working out of Kingai in the south of Baffin Island. And this is part of a project I lead with a glaciologist at Duke. as well as with the Inuit artist community in Kingaai, looking at the ways in which Inuit lived experience and knowledge of the land is translated into their art and has been over the last 66 years. And right now we're focusing on the ways in which sea ice in particular has been documented. But my background more broadly is on historic landscape painting and visual culture. And so the example on the right is a watercolor by a Danish geologist made in the 1870s on a government-sponsored expedition, so Danish government-sponsored expedition to Greenland, in which the artist is also a geologist there to look out for new mineral deposits, as well as study this incredible glacier, Frederiksborg Isblink or Sierkapssamia. And this paper, which is the result of a study, a sort of several years study of these watercolors, looks at the materiality. So I'm also really interested in materiality, which I think tends to get scientists a little bit more interested in what I do. How things are made, what are they made of? And that becomes ever more pertinent when you're talking about ice.
Thanks so much, Izzy. Matthew?
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Izzy, and thanks, Radcliffe. It's great to be here. Everyone, thank you for being here. So let's see, we're at a cocktail party or something like that. And so I was born and raised in Alaska, and so my work comes very much out of those experiences with climate change that I was experiencing along with everyone else while I was studying music. My background's in computer music and composition. So what I would tell people at the party is that I study climate change and environmental systems from the sound perspective, and I co-compose music with the environment, like with wind and glaciers, rivers, ice fields, seagrasses, etc. And usually there aren't any more questions after I say that at the party.
Thank you so much. So sticking with this party scenario, what questions do people tend to ask you when you try to explain your research? And relatedly, what does when the average person thinks about ice and glaciers and climate change these days, do you find that they have common misconceptions or fictions in mind?
Well, so we have a very abstract relationship to nature, and this extends to scholars and artists who work on environmental systems. Even scientists who work closely with measuring the environment often don't live in the ecosystems that they study. And this is why I think a native perspective is so important, that we don't have a fictional relationship to the place or a mediated relationship to the place, but a real lived experience with it. Particularly with snow and ice, a lot of people's perceptions rely on mediated ways of relating to the world, like looking through a window from a climate controlled room. And this brings a lot of misconceptions. For example, it's the colors, the shapes are so impressive to look at in videos and in photographs and paintings, but it's actually really hard to deal with snow and ice. And then that's, I think, something that people have a misconception about. Like, it's just very cold and remote and challenging to reach. And once you're there, you have to kind of go into a different mode of perception. Maybe you can't stay long, or if you do, you have to really prepare for that. Maybe it makes sense to share a couple of sounds at this point. So we'll listen to a couple of recordings that I made. The first one is of a glacier, and I want us to think about how the glacier sound differs from the way we see this impressive mass of ice, which is, tens of miles long. This is the Matanuska Glacier in the Chugach Mountains that comes out of Mount Marcus Baker. It's it's a healthy glacier in Alaska, but maybe we could listen to a little bit of that. I won't get into how that recording's made, but it's a very special recording. And we can hear in that recording the kind of size of the glacier, but it's a more muted. What's really in the foreground are these small details, and the ice is really alive with sound and an incredible symphony of sound. If you move the microphone over a little bit, you hear a new pattern, a new melody, a new rhythm, and the glacier is really just alive with that. In the second example is of an iceberg. Again, we hear the iceberg floating in the Gulf of Alaska. We can get a sense of its body below the water because of those waves that are moving it around. But primarily in the foreground, what we're listening to are small pockets of air that are escaping from the ice as it melts, pressurized air that's been trapped in there for thousands of years pops into our atmosphere with a pressure differential, and we hear it as a little tiny pop. And there's just millions of these air pockets escaping in that small example of the iceberg. So I'm very often kind of working with the misconceptions of the glaciers and the ice fields as impressive visual icons and trying to focus in on their voices and their small kind of nuances.
Thank you, Matthew. Izzy, any misconceptions or burning questions that people tend to express when you explain your research to them?
Yeah, so I think art history and sort of the history of visual culture has a lot to sort of answer for when it comes to how we actually visualize the Arctic. Obviously, my research, it starts in the 19th century at a time of heightened polar exploration, when this sublime image of the Arctic, one of a vast, unpopulated, barren wilderness, is being created and being disseminated to a large public audience. And that language, maybe not the image so much, I think we've been kind of conditioned to understand that the Arctic, or not conditioned, that's the wrong word, sort of like visually kind of informed that the Arctic is actually a space that is peopled and has been for millennia, that it's a sort of a environment teeming with life, more than human as well as human. And so I think that sort of appreciation of the Arctic has certainly shifted. And so I don't find myself explaining that to people. But I do find that sort of the language, the sort of terminology that we use to describe Arctic environments still exists. And so one of my bugbears is the term wilderness. And there are obviously spaces that are quote unquote a wilderness, but more generally, this terminology keeps perpetuating this idea of an empty landscape. And actually, the ways in which we're seeing and we're visualizing the Arctic through art history and visual culture inherently means that there are people in that space. And so a space cannot be beyond human control or beyond human experience if people are already there experiencing it. And so that's been one of the sort of big terminology questions that I find myself having to explain, and I've tried to tackle quite a bit in my research. And then there's the visual one. And I guess this is also something that I had to become sort of untrain myself to think about when I started sort of looking at sort of frozen landscapes, which was this idea that ice is white, and this idea that the Arctic is a either dark space environment or white. And that there is this sort of binary of color where actually, in fact, there's a whole range of colors. The ice is blue. It can be the most vivid blue. I wore these earrings, as a side note, for a reason today. They're actually by a Greenlandic artist who made them inspired by the colors of the ice of Greenland. And so I really try with my work to draw attention to how colorful the Arctic is as an environment and how landscape painting can really show that. I think if we look back to the piece I showed, if your memory serves you well, of the Greenlandic glacier done by the geologist in the 1870s, he's constantly as well commenting on it. So at the same time as this narrative of a white space is being perpetuated, here he is also commenting on the fact of like how deep and dark blue the crevasses were and how much color there was reflecting off of the ice. And so as people sort of ask me, when they sort of say these sort of misconceptions, I'm very quick to correct them. But I think generally the questions as well that follow are, they vary again from the disciplines. Again, I work quite closely across sort of the humanities and the sciences. And the first question many scientists, many glaciologists will ask me will be like, why? Why are we looking at art to sort of understand environmental history or environmental change? And for many, that is not a lack of appreciation for art. It's just that kind of quantitative, qualitative understanding of research. And actually, perhaps there is no quantitative data that looking at history of art might offer, but it actually offers a different way of getting into stories, human stories, environmental histories, of telling different experiences and relationships to ice. And then there's the humanities, and I find that's often much more methodological. And so trying to understand how are you framing the depiction of ice? What methodologies are you working with? And for those of you who are clearly sort of burning to ask me that question in the Q&A section, I think very eco-critically about landscape painting and glacial landscapes, and really advocate for that the only way to do an interdisciplinary study of glaciers in art history is to be collaborative. And so again, for me, a lot of it is explaining how I work with glaciologists, how I work with Inuit artists in the Canadian Arctic, and actually what those research processes look like to getting to grips with the depiction of ice.
Thank you so much, Izzy, and thanks, Matthew. Let's stay on the subject of representation. So in everyday media representations, we often see ice caps portrayed as ecological sentinels of climate change. They're visible recession and recomposition, along with the heart-rending images of the plight of polar bears clinging to shrinking solid footing. Ice formations in that way are kind of like canaries in a coal mine. They're supposed to tell us what's in store and what urgent actions and precautions to take. This also reminds me of how people have likewise historically conceived of artists as sentinels of the winds of social change, anticipating, representing, critiquing relationships between and among people and animals and environments, and how the ways in which societies treat their artists can be a useful indicator of how they treat people in general and how they treat the natural world. A few weeks ago, Matthew, Izzy, the two of you and I had a planning meeting. We met on Zoom to briefly plan out this conversation, and we touched on the question briefly of what artists can do for a world in climate precarity, but by the same token, also the question of what such a world can do for artists, irrespective of whether or not they are working explicitly with topics of climate change. I'd like to invite both of you to just chew on these thoughts, these analogies and reciprocities.
Yeah, I think that follows on nicely, perhaps from what I was sort of touching upon in the previous question. I'm a big believer in, I think art has a really important role to play in, say, communicating and disseminating scientific knowledge, as well as changes that are occurring in the climate. And I think that is a very important way in which we can reach and sort of synthesize data and material for a wider public. But as an art historian, as someone who doesn't make art, I rely on the work of others. I'm really interested in actually how we can flip that. And I think that's the sort of the second part of your question is actually how might we learn from the sciences and how much we actually incorporate a scientific language into how we understand art, and how might actually the way in which we as art historians describe, say, a painting be informed by a language that already exists elsewhere. And that's been really important for me into how we might understand glacial landscape paintings, say from the 1870s, in relation to not only climate change, but also continuity. So I'm really as well interested in this big question of like, actually, what hasn't changed? What remains the same? And I think we see a lot of changes happening with regards to sea ice in particular. We see sea ice in the news almost weekly at this point. And so working on a project in which I'm working in a community where local sea ice conditions have been studied very closely for about 20 years in this community. And yet at no point have the artists working in this community been seen as holding sort of primary forms of knowledge, despite having created art, pictorial sort of drawing and printmaking in this community for 66 years. And so part of what I'm really trying to do with this project is, and my ongoing relationship with these artists in Kinga'i, is how might we actually understand art as a form of traditional knowledge? How might we actually understand the ways in which environmental change and continuity have been captured in drawings and prints that are made on an almost weekly basis for a period of 66 years? And you end up with this unprecedented record that isn't quantitative in the same ways that perhaps studying satellite data is, but it does offer us a different perception of how people are engaging with, say, the sea ice. And how those relationships have had to adapt and change, and how visually we might evidence these changes. And so I'm really interested in, again, how can we actually tease out the nuances of this sort of climate and art relationship to have a more historical picture as well, something that looks back in time to understand where we are in the present day. But also, how might we develop sort of ways of working that ensure that this isn't one discipline at the service of another, or, that we're extracting knowledge in any way to sort of prop up our own research or our own practice. But, again, how do we flip some of these prevailing questions on their head in a way that is productive for everyone?
Thank you, Izzy. Matthew.
Well, this is a beautiful question, Will. Thank you for conceiving of it, the relationship between the art and the artist and the environment and global warming. I do think that we should think of conservation of the imagination as we think of conservation of the environment. Your question reminded me to look back at the score for Soundcast of Matanuska Glacier, which is the piece that I wrote that first field recording is from. And in that score, I wrote that that I feel that the health is intimately reflects our own, that when the glaciers are gone, we will retreat as well. And that there was this kind of, inside that music, there was this kind of warning to people that were so intimately tied up with these earth animals, as I described them in that thing, that that they will lead to they will signal our own demise. And that's, that piece was, the BBC said it was a beautiful apocalypse, which at the time I thought was like not what I was trying to express in the music. But when I did start making this music, so this is to address the question of how can the arts and relate to climate change and help. But when I started making music with snow and ice and glaciers back in the 1990s, I focused on the communication. So I felt like people in the North were aware of global warming more than people further south. And so the music was kind of expressing those warnings and starting to develop a language for working with those systems, kind of music theory of ecoacoustics. But I think it was after Hurricane Sandy in 2012 that I felt a shift in that mode of communication activism towards, people seem to know about the relationship between melting ice and rising sea levels. And the project kind of shifted for me from being about communication of the system to using the art in collaboration with the public policy and with science, and trying to develop this more collaborative approach, working with scientists, scientific knowledge, and politicians. And so lately, I feel like my work is much more closely aligned with science, like Izzy is talking about, that and taking data from scientists and turning it into music, and particularly not just one-sided, not just as the broader impacts of science and communicating science out to the public, but rather really how the music can be contributing to the environmental science and helping inspire our better understanding of science. I think it can go both ways.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate both of your perspectives, and as Matthew put it, the how there might be intertwined destinies between conservation of imagination and conservation of environment. We need to be able to imagine. I mean, I think it's easy for everyone these days with media stories about climate change to imagine the end of the world and what climate disaster looks like because many people have experienced the effects of it. It's harder for us to imagine where we go from here and to imagine a world in 500 years that will still be hospitable to all, where all living things can flourish. Um, yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you. Um, I think we can always learn a lot about people um, from the values and the exposure to information and stories that they had growing up. And I'm just curious about how the two of you arrived at your present passion projects. Are there any memories from childhood or adolescence with respect to climate in general or ice in particular? What sorts of encounters with images, sounds, stories were instrumental in you becoming who you are today and being part of this webinar?
Well, I grew up in the Alaskan Arctic, so it's kind of hard for me to separate out the individual experiences. But just to say that, that living with the snow and the ice, the glaciers, I feel like I'm pretty much doing the same thing in some ways. I often draw on my experiences from when I was like 5 in my work right now, which is really a curious phenomenon to me. I wonder if other people do that at such an impressionable age. And my parents, taught me to respect the environment and the indigenous people, and I still do that. My work is very kind of closely interested in listening to and kind of co-creating knowledge with the environment, and that's been a big part of it. So when we listen to those field recordings, they are, those two examples we heard are just field recordings, but later on they develop into composed layers in parallel with those, in counterpoint with those sounds and with data systems. But it's really starts with that field recording and really listening to the songs that are inside the world already, and then kind of trying to draw those into the imagination and let something new come out that's a human expression, but not to take the place of the environmental um, creativity, but to rather like let those things co-evolve. And I could point to a lot of different, very specific instances. I always, my mom used to carry me on a backpack with facing out, so our backs were together, and I always, talk about that because she let me face into the wind and face into the environment, and I think that that's really, the key is being kind of exposed to the real world.
Thank you, Matthew. Izzy.
Yeah, I love this question. So at the age of 10, I moved to Sweden, which introduced me to the wonderful world of the Nordic countries and very much shaped how I think about northern landscapes, circumpolar landscapes. Obviously didn't know it at the age of 10 that it was going to do that, that it was going to make me into an art historian. A story that my late neighbor used to love telling us repeatedly every year was how that very first Christmas when we arrived, and I'm a 10-year old girl from the south of England, and the excitement, he could hear the excitement when the first snow arrived. And just this constant, fascination with snow, and teaching my sister how to ice skate on a frozen puddle and then on the lake, and sort of growing up in a place where I was fortunate to be able to experience, a proper winter. And I've seen that change. I've moved around a lot in those 20 odd years, but I've still experienced that change at home, of warming winters, of shifting seasons. But I've also, again, going back to that continuity question that I mentioned earlier, it was really the sort of rich, this is, not ice, but it was really the rich summer and winter sunsets that set me on a path to writing my first book, which was all about landscape painting around the circumpolar north at the turn of the century. And because I saw in these paintings the landscape and the sunsets that I had seen growing up. And I thought that there was something that needed to be said about these that had not yet been said, and that there was a sort of an eco-critical reading. There was a study of landscape painting that was more attuned to personal experiences of the environment, that perhaps I could say, but perhaps I had an experience that was relevant to a discussion of these paintings. And so no, the growing up in Sweden literally led to who I am today. If my parents hadn't moved me there, I probably wouldn't have done this. And then I just gradually worked my way further north, because once you've started, you might as well keep going. So
Thank you, Izzy. Thanks, Matthew. Just this is just a random question, but I think it's one that can help us understand your priorities and your research, which is, are there any burning questions that literally keep you up at night these days, whether tangential to your research or directly like a problem that you're trying to solve in your art or your critique of art? Perhaps Izzy, you could follow up on what you just said.
yeah, I think it's maybe twofold. I've been researching the Arctic for near on a decade now, and I think it's one of those sad things that the research is becoming more and more current in the times that we live in. And sort of geopolitically, you can't not think about landscape and human interactions with landscape around the Arctic. And so that is a question that keeps me up, of like, how can I, in what ways can I keep doing this work that is productive for, and actually working with people in the Arctic, more and more, how can I actually do academic research that is of interest to people living in the Arctic and experiencing changes, and being caught up in this sort of geopolitical landscape that we live in. The second thing is perhaps a little bit more sinister. It's a little less, I mean, I think both maybe a little sinister and less joyful. I think a lot about art, but less late at night. Is what's happening, my concerns around whose voices are being heard and what stories are being told in sort of the world that we're living in. And those concerns around, especially in the UK, around sort of curiosity-driven research. And, what happens if we're living in a world where we're no longer able to just explore things because we love it or because we have a personal relationship to it. And obviously it has a larger role to play in the society we live in, but, there are concerns around the role of the humanities. And you feel this desperate need to make yourself relevant, even when you've been doing it long before the humanities were, such a topical concern. And so I think those are the questions that sort of really keep me up at night, of sort of how can I ensure that my research is done in a way that is useful and in a way that can be sustained in the kind of ever-changing environment that we live in.
Thank you, Izzy.
I teach ecoacoustics, and I always tell the students that, I think that there's a chance that someone could write the piece of music that would, connect with the particularly intractable problems that we face now and offer some solution, I do believe that that art could be made. But that is, to me, the the real problem is how we navigate use of the environment and sustainability of the environment. And we've seen this, of course, since I was born in Alaska. We've seen this kind of tension, and it's led to a lot of issues with environmental devastation. Just right now, the village of Nuiqsut just sued the federal government because for violating the contract that they signed for the Willow Project. And they're basically fighting on behalf of the caribou to keep those uh, fellow living beings alive and sustaining as they have been for a long time. These kinds of tensions are not just related to one political party. They're really bipartisan abdication of the responsibilities that kind of will allow us to use the environment and also sustain it. Those things are very complicated, and sometimes it feels a bit hopeless if you're just a humanist, or an artist, and even probably a scientist. Like, you can only do your work, and how do you address those problems? I kind of think of education as one of the best hopes we have. That is, educating people, continuing to keep the the possibility open that some young person could come along and create the work of science, of art, of humanities scholarship that could transform that relationship and offer a solution forward for society. Those things definitely keep me up at night, Will.
Thanks, Matthew. I guess they might start keeping me up at night too, now that you've articulated it so eloquently. I really appreciate your responses so much, both of yours, because um, this idea of it's not like you're saying, Matthew, that we're all waiting for a magical hero to come along who can write that awe-inspiring composition that instantly educates and shifts a mindset that spurs everyone into collective action that will forestall climate disaster. But I think it's also important not to deride that kind of thinking or that kind of wishfulness, because that's what actually motivates us to make and to create and to imagine in the first place. This is totally unrelated, but during lockdown, COVID lockdown, I remember thinking about Vladimir Putin and the war in Ukraine, and our minds were not the logical minds that we sometimes have outside of lockdown. So I got into this really deep thought experiment of maybe Putin will one day just hear this really beautiful musical performance and decide to call off his military operation. And I, as a musicologist, I know how Pollyannish that is. I know that's not the answer, but my mind went there anyway, and it stayed there for a while. And it's the same with people who think about, mind-altering drugs or psilocybin, and people used to have these dreams of what would happen if all the world leaders trying to kill one another just chilled out for a bit. I'm not saying that you're saying that art can get us there, but I think it's so important to conserve some of that, as we're talking about here, that kind of childlike wonder that allows us to try things we haven't tried and to collaborate with people across disciplines and different knowledge bases and geographic locations that we haven't really thought of doing.
Will, let
Yeah,
me just respond and bring back something Izzy said before about the collaboration between fields, because I think you're right that to present it such as it seems like an oversimplification, this idea that an artist could do something, but could transform the state, the song could move Putin, whatever, but the but it can shape the discourse, and that's, I think, a very underestimated aspect of art and humanities when they're combined with sciences and public policy. can actually create something that together maybe would uh, offer such a possible solution, whether that's in, implementing new policies or just changing the public imagination of these problems.
Thank you, Matthew. Just a note to the audience, we are taking questions in the Q&A, so if you have any questions, as mentioned, please feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll read as many as we can out loud. There are already several questions, and it seems like there are three comments that all kind of touch on the same thing, which is I'll read one in particular, which says. There is a tension between the visual beauty of ice and the devastation of its loss through climate change. How should artists navigate that tension, or what responsibility do artists have when making climate processes visually compelling? A couple of other comments mentioned just how great and beautiful the sound examples were, the visual examples were. Um, do you think sometimes about this tension between the aesthetic and the ethical, and what happens when people find themselves distracted by just how pretty ice can look in paintings, or how serene, let's just say, ice sounds when it's just a field recording? Izzy, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Again, I work with primarily historical media, and otherwise I work with a group of artists who are sort of, again, creating on a sort of daily, weekly basis in response to the seasons and as the year is moving through. So the sea ice is everly increasingly a smaller time of the year that they're kind of thinking about it and working with it. I think there is something in the beauty of ice that does allow it, give it more to work with. I think, there is an ability to work with ice, say art historically, perhaps in part because of its beauty, but it's about how you then frame that. So, for me, it's thinking again, going back to that color question of, ice not as just something that is pure white or pure blue, something that is dirty, something that is colorful in good ways as well as bad, something that picks up and absorbs both, light, but also dust particles. And I think the more and more we can draw attention to how sort of like thinking about art history, more and more how we might actually tease out what's actually happening on the ice. Why is this not that crisp blue? Is it just because the artist didn't have the palette, or maybe they're talking about something else? And I think again, I don't really work with contemporary artists who don't live in the Arctic, and so their experiences of ice is not one in the community I work with is not one of climate change when they're depicting ice. It is one of just it's part of their environment, it's part of their land, it's part of the way they think. It's yes, they're aware of climate change, and yes, for many they are working with the theme of climate change, but it's more than that. It's just a way of living. And I think how we draw attention to that is the challenge. How do we again draw attention to ice not as a sublime experience where you can hop on a cruise and go see a calving glacier or see an iceberg drifting through the sea, but actually how do we talk about ice as something that is part of the land? How do we talk about ice that is part of the way in which people have lived as well as continue to live? And how do we draw on that history to better contextualize and better present these quote unquote beautiful frozen landscapes?
Thank you so much.
I think it's about like love songs. So like I think, that the love song or the breakup song, it presents a kind of human drama that we feel emotionally invested in, even as we're saddened by it, we're also enlivened by it. And that's to me, that's the in from music, that's one of the ways that I think we can listen to these climate change pieces, particularly around melting ice. It's to start feeling invested in the human drama of these earth animals undergoing a rapid transformation, and maybe even um, a breaking up or or ending. And that's when we start investing in the kind of the human qualities of the environment, I think that the music and the art is doing something valuable for us in recognizing our kinship with these other beings that we wouldn't normally endow with intelligence or consciousness or these other traits. So I think that the art, the environmental art, can kind of learn a lot from the love song, and and that there's something similar happening in that in an ideal situation. Yeah, I could say more about this, but I'll let the next.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great metaphor. Because I was thinking it it may be that the way that the current art and music that's being made with respect to ice, that this art reads very differently to people, let's say 500 years from now, right? Maybe in 500 years, the world will look so different, feel so different, ice and otherwise, where that music reads as devastatingly nostalgic rather than just purely aesthetically beautiful. Maybe it signals some lost era where it's already a point of no return. Or if aliens came and saw, these depictions of ice, um, what might they make of them? They might not read them in the same way. And as both of you emphasized, indigenous populations, people who live with the ice and might read things very differently than a student in, let's say, intro to climate change when they're exposed to examples of art. Um, there are other questions in the chat, and I'll just try to get to as many as possible as I mentioned. One question asks about the substantial environmental footprint required for most forms of travel. And so this person is asking how artists navigate that. Do they have to go on site in order to make quote unquote authentic work, or are there ways of doing art, of making interventions that that do not require travel that ironically, contributes to that footprint?
Well, I think you have to go. I do think you have to be outside. Like, so there's a phenomenon in the field of computer music where people use samples that other people made. And that extends from, not just sampling of other music, but sampling libraries of sounds that have been recorded by someone else in the field. So you're basically using someone else's idea of the environment. And what's very valuable for artists is to experience it in person and find their own way of relating to it, their own kind of imaginative interaction. I don't think you can have that kind of imaginative interaction with the environment without being there. But that being said, you don't have to go far, right? You can go outside. You don't have to burn carbon, to go across the world to be on a glacier, right? That's not at all necessary. In fact, I think people should focus on their native habitats that they know and have something really kind of a deep knowledge about. So, figuring out what that is, where you have the most experience, and it may be in urban environments too, right? I mean, there's this work doesn't just end at the border of suburbia and the city. It extends right into the built environment and the human spaces. And so I think, figuring that out and then finding a way to address the world that's immediately outside. But I do think that the in-person engagement outside is critical.
Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, I can just very quickly touch upon that. It's something, it's a sort of question that something I'm grappling with all the time with how I do my work. I'm an academic based in the northeast of Scotland, formerly in Toronto, which did make my life easier. But I spend a lot of my time traveling, twice a year back across to Canada to go to the Arctic to be able to do this research. And I could easily sit on my computer and have virtual calls, but but then I'm kind of doing the research in a way that isn't sustainable and keeps perpetuating the same narratives. And it's so important for me to be able to build a relationship with the artists I'm working with, to actually be there and to see them work and to have conversations. And there is obviously a formalized part of the research process. However, it's the being there, it's the showing up and the being present, and it's hard to do. It is both logistically, financially, morally, it is a challenge. But I think if we want to push, say, academic research on the Arctic in the right direction, then part of that has to be a commitment by the researcher to actually showing up and being present and being in that space and being with the people. And yes, are we being the most environmentally friendly we could be? No. But I think it goes back to that sort of point that Matthew raised earlier around, if we could create the peace that solved all the world's problems, I think if, we could not take the flight that reduced all of the world's CO2 levels, we would do it. But I think at this point, to be able to do this research well, to be able to ensure that the voices are giving the platform that they deserve and that they should have, then part of that is accepting that you are maybe part of the problem.
Thank
Well
you, Izzy.
said,
Thank you,
Izzy.
Matthew.
Well said.
So we have a couple of questions about expanding the geographical scope. One person asks, I'm interested to hear about any narratives beyond the Arctic-centric perspective. My own artistic practice is winter limnology centered in the Great Plains. For example, how does the sound of melting shift? Or in art history, what other narratives besides melting are found to illuminate the entropic nature of ice? Semicolon. This is another question kind of related. Someone else asks, on the topic of interdisciplinary collaboration, do either of you work with artists or scholars in Southeast Asia and the tropics? I am imagining the eco-conservation dialogues that would be drawn between you on ice, salt, mangroves, cinnamon forests, migration, etc.
I can't remember, but I'll go first.
Yeah.
No, so there is a lot of really great work being done. Karen Gagne who has done a lot of work on sort of alpine frozen landscapes in the global south. I don't personally work with anybody in outside of the Arctic Circle because that is very much my research area. But I think there's a lot, and I think the field is expanding. I think this goes back to the sort of the introduction to this session about the fact how broad and how rapidly expanding this field is, and how artists and historians and art historians and scientists are more broadly engaging in interdisciplinary collaboration across the globe. And there's a fantastic author, Jessica J. Lee, who I believe has just finished a book manuscript, to go to the water limnology question, who's just finished a book manuscript that's all about water, and believe it touches on limnology, so that might be worth keeping an eye out for. But I think there's still a lot more to be done on a collaborative sense, but I think geographically this research is growing so rapidly that I think the next, decade, where we were in 10 years ago, is who knows where we're going to be in 10 years, but it's exciting to see it expand so much.
Yeah, I think this is a great question because it's true that Izzy and I both are working, focused on the Arctic, and for me, for sure, that's where my experience came from. That's why I started doing this work. But one of the things I noticed, particularly after around 2009, was that the same techniques that I developed to work in Alaska could be applied to other places. And there really wasn't like a geographical limitation. And it kind of inspired me to start thinking more theoretically about it, like developing music theory that could then be applied in different places. And so, that I tried that out in different ways. And even though, these weren't my places that I felt comfortable with or knew a lot about, it seemed that the techniques could be applied there. And then if they were put into the hands of the right people, then that they could, develop a body of work like I felt like I was working on in Alaska. So this is part of the education model too, is that the students are all going to have every every type. They're going to come from all over the place. They're going to have very different knowledge bases, but with the same kind of methods and ideas, they could apply those in their own way, in their own native environments. And that's been, I think really exciting aspect of this research for me.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks, Izzy. I think we have time for just one more question and your answers. Um, Several people in the Q&A have asked just generally about your advice to people looking to do similar work. What advice would you have for, say, a student who is passionate about both art and music and climate change? Um, or let's just imagine if you could go back like 10, 20 years and give yourself some advice, what would you tell that young version of yourself so that it might set them on a path to where you are now?
Well, I would say lean into your personal experience. I spent way too long trying to be someone else's experience, going to Europe, trying to write music like Europeans and like that. When I finally realized that I should lean into my own personal experience, that's when things really started to make sense for me. And so I would recommend that. I think that also another general thing that I can say in just 30 seconds here is that thinking between the micro and the macro. So you lean into your experience, so you have your knowledge base and you stick with your knowledge base. You don't try to be a scientist if you're an artist. You don't try to be like a scholar if you're a scientist. You know, lean into your expertise and into your kind of authentic, grounded experience. And then think of micro and macro. So look very closely at the environment, listen very closely to the environment, and then zoom out and take a big picture, listen or look at the system and find between those scales of environmental engagement, you find yourself in dialogue with the environment. If I were to, that's a 30-second advice.
Thank you, Matthew. That's great.
I'll
Thanks,
be
Izzy.
very pithy. Firstly, you've heard a lot about interdisciplinarity today. Don't feel like you need, if you're, an aspiring PhD student or you want to sort of broadly do interdisciplinary work, don't feel like you need to know everything. That's where collaboration comes in. You don't need to be an interdisciplinary scholar. You can just do interdisciplinary research with others. And secondly, I'm going to borrow the lean into wording. Lean into how you think the research should be done or the work should be done, the creative practice should be done. Maybe it's peculiar. Maybe nobody, people are questioning why you're doing it this way. Lean into it, own it, because chances are it will become the way that it's done. And if it's not, you'll have learned something good in the process.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, Izzy. Thanks, Matthew. This concludes our program today. I want to thank both Matthew and Izzy for their terrific conversations, and our audience for very thoughtful questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted in about a week. For information about upcoming Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events, including the earlier partner program to this one titled Glaciers, Meanings, and Methodologies, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. And thank you all again for joining us today, and take care.